Greta Thunberg addressing a crowd in front of a governmental building, with reporters and photographers filming and photographing from behind the stage. Figure 6.1, Greta Thunberg speaks to thousands of climate activists in front of Germany's parliament at the Reichstag building in September 2021. Credit: Greta Thunberg spricht beim Klimastreik vor dem Reichstag by Stefan Müller/Flickr, CC by 2. Chapter outline. 6.1 Political socialization, the ways people become political. 6.2 Political culture, how people express their political identity. 6.3 Collective dilemmas, making group decisions. 6.4 Collective action problems, the problem of incentives. 6.5 Resolving collective action problems. As a young teen, Greta Thunberg's first foray into environmental activism was persuading her parents to reduce their carbon footprint in an attempt to reduce their family's contribution to global climate change. By age 15, she took to protesting alone on a bench outside the Swedish parliament, gradually drawing attention for her persistence. Soon thereafter, Thunberg was inspiring environmental protests in schools around the world, with as many as 1.6 million students from some 120 countries participating in efforts to prevent catastrophic climate degradation, one to the extent that Thunberg's individual actions will influence political choices. It will be because these actions have helped create a movement, inspire interest groups and parties, and lead governments to change their policies. Despite these worldwide protests, it is not at all clear that environmental policies will change rapidly and dramatically. One reason for this is that powerful interests oppose taking action. Another reason, one that this chapter will consider in some detail, is that even when individuals agree that action must be taken, it can be difficult to come to an agreement on exactly what those actions should be. Opportunities to free ride or to take advantage of the global commons continue to be difficult to address despite the passionate efforts of so many to change them. All political action is ultimately individual action, but even if you were Greta Thunberg, you would not be able to make political change entirely on your own. Only when groups of individuals come together to take collective action can they make political decisions that lead to change. Candidates run as individuals, but to win elections, they typically need the backing of an organized political party with, especially in the case of national elections, perhaps millions of supporters. Legislatures are composed of individual politicians, but they act through groups, for example, committees, caucuses, and the party organization. Political movements form when enough individuals come together in common purpose to seek political change. Even an emperor is likely to receive advice from some sort of cabinet, and for an emperor to accomplish anything, they will need the support of a military or a bureaucracy. Unless individuals come together with others, their ability to affect or resist change is minuscule. Thunberg's efforts will come to naught unless those seeking to mitigate climate change are able to overcome collective dilemmas too. This chapter focuses on group action. Humans, in all their marvelous diversity, act for all sorts of reasons. Some of these reasons are instrumental and strategic. People do this to get that, but others are more properly seen as expressive and symbolic. People act not to get, but to be or to display. The distinction between expressive and instrumental actions is not precise, and these behaviors overlap, as noted in Chapter 2. Political behavior is human behavior. Consider the mass protests against the government of Cuba that broke out in the summer of 2021.3. Those protesting may have done so to express anger, an emotion, show solidarity, symbolic behavior, and/or seek political change, instrumental action. Though it is not yet possible to hook up sensors to a person's brain to learn what triggered each element of their behavior, it is possible to recognize the potential importance of different types of triggers. You learned in Chapter 2 that individuals can be rational and also intuitive, strategic yet expressive, self-interested but still public-spirited. These concepts carry over to the study of group behavior, focusing on the expressive, symbolic, or emotional aspects of individuals within groups, as well as the rational, instrumental, and strategic behaviors of individuals in group decision-making. 4. An overhead photograph shows a large, tree-lined city street completely filled with people. Skyscrapers are visible in the background. Figure 6.2, the streets of Hong Kong are jammed with protesters in 2019. Credit, IMG, by Studio Incendo/Flickr, CC by 2. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to define political socialization. Describe the main influences on a person's political socialization. Analyze the ways social media has affected political socialization. Discuss the factors that determine which influences will have the greatest impact on a person's political socialization. Do you consider yourself to have a political identity? Do you belong to or identify with a political party? Do you have a political ideology, such as conservative, libertarian, liberal, or populist? Are you apolitical, indifferent to politics, or are you deeply engaged in political action? Whatever your answers are, there is a chance, but a rather small one, that you deliberately and thoughtfully made these choices at a single moment by analytically comparing the various alternatives. It's more likely that your choices gradually emerged over time through a complex combination of environmental and social influences, interacting with your own personal biological and psychological makeup. It is not entirely clear how Greta Thunberg became a climate change activist. For example, although her father's font was named after his grandfather, a Nobel Prize-winning scientist who identified the link between increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide, CO2, and higher global temperatures. 5. She grew up in Sweden, a country with a strong ethic of environmentalism. By some measures, it is ranked as the most environmentally friendly country in the world. 6. She reports learning about climate change by age 8 and credits the American student activists who protested gun laws after the Parkland, Florida school shootings with inspiring her to act. 7. The gradual process of developing values and beliefs, of people becoming who they are as adults, is socialization, and the slow development of who a person becomes as a political being is political socialization. 8. Through political socialization, people develop their political ideology in the broadest sense. This includes not only their values and attitudes regarding the role of citizens and the government, but also regarding issues such as social justice or climate change. Socialization also influences whether a person is likely to have any interest in politics at all. Political socialization is neither premeditated nor preordained, although there is a growing body of evidence that indicates that there are genetic links to political predispositions. 9. As an infant, you did not choose who you would become as an adult. As you grew, you were subject to a wide variety of forces that shaped your personality. Some of these forces were present in your physical environment, such as your home was their lead paint on the walls, your neighborhood was it safe. 10. And your school, was it a place you looked forward to going to? 11. As your physical environment shapes your learning, it also influences your views and attitudes, even if you are unaware of these influences. A group of children gathers to have their picture taken in an open area outdoors in front of dense trees. Some children crouch on the ground and some stand behind them. Figure 6.3. People who grow up under insecure conditions, like these Kurdish refugee children, will experience political socialization differently than those who grow up in safer environments. Credit: Kurdish children bunch together to have their photograph taken while playing at a refugee camp by Department of Defense, American Forces Information Service, Defense Visual Information Center. 1994 10/26/2007 National Archives Catalog, public domain. The line from your social and physical environment to your political personality may be indirect. If you grew up in a heavily policed neighborhood, attended a deteriorating school, and lacked safe drinking water, your attitudes about government are likely to differ from an otherwise identical individual who lived in a comfortable home with safe drinking water and attended a well-resourced school in an affluent neighborhood. Humans are complicated, and it would be unwise to conclude that all those growing up in privilege are identically socialized, or that those raised lacking such privilege all have the same political personalities. Your social and physical environments do not determine your political personality, but they can have an important influence. The role of the family. The family is usually considered the most important influence on both a person's overall socialization and their political socialization. Families profoundly affect people's views about religion, work, and education, 12 people gradually develop these preferences, attitudes, and behaviors as they grow from infants to adolescents to adults. The impact families have on people's lives does not vanish when they become adults. It is likely to persist over their lifetimes. The influence need not always flow from the parents to the child. Greta Thunberg's activism led her parents to reconsider their own environmental attitudes, and research suggests that children often affect their parents' views on the environment. 13. Your family is likely to exert a substantial influence on your political views. 14. In some political settings in which a child's identity is defined by religion, ethnicity, and place, their political views may seem almost predetermined. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, for example, the three main groups tend to be divided by ethnicity and religion, which largely define their political affiliations. Ethnic Bosniaks tend to be Muslim, Croats tend to be Roman Catholic, and Serbs are mainly Orthodox Christians. These differing ethnic and religious groups largely determine individuals' political affiliations. There is little political intermingling across ethnic and religious lines. 15. In most places around the world, if parents raise their children in a particular religious faith, those children are more likely than not to adopt that faith as they become adults. Or, if the children are raised in no faith, they are less likely to have religious connections as adults. 16. The same is true for almost any other important facet of life. Social attitudes, beliefs about the role of the family, and yes, political beliefs. This is not to say that beliefs are automatically transmitted. Young people have agency and may accept, reject, or simply question what their parents believe. 17. The changing political landscape. The changing family. Families play a key role in political socialization, and family structure is evolving in different ways around the world. One fundamental change is family size. Fertility rates have dropped in virtually every country in the past century. The People's Republic of China, PRC, provides an extreme example. When the PRC was established in 1949, the government encouraged families to have children to create additional workers, and by the 1960s, the typical Chinese family had 6 children. At that point, political leaders became worried about rapid population growth, and so in 1980 they instituted a one-child policy strictly enforced through a combination of benefits and often harsh penalties. The policy dramatically slowed population growth, and it substantially increased both the age of and the percentage of males in the population. Under this policy, a cultural preference for male children led to sex-selective abortions and female infanticide. Believing that they had gone too far, the Chinese government lifted the one-child policy in 2016.18. Video: What it was like to grow up under China's one-child policy. In this TED Talk, Chinese filmmaker Nanfu Wang describes her experiences as a child growing up under China's one-child policy, and as an adult making a documentary about people's experiences under the policy. Family structure involves not only how many children are in a family, but where they live when they effectively become adults. As of 2016, a higher percentage, 52%, of 18 to 29-year-olds in the United States were living with their parents than at any time since 1900.19 among wealthy countries. The percentage of 15 to 29-year-olds living with their parents varied from about 80% in Italy to 30% in Canada. 20. Given what we already know about how family members can influence each other's political attitudes and beliefs, it will be interesting to see how these changing family structures and living conditions impact political socialization. Your parents' political leanings and your broader family environment affect your political views. For example, who is expected to take responsibility for caring for parents as they age varies from country to country. In China, caring for one's parents is a sacred duty. In Norway, it is more often seen as an obligation of the government. Germans and Italians are more than twice as likely as Americans to say that the government, rather than the family, has the main responsibility for caring for the elderly. 21. Note that these statements, like other generalizations, are not true for every person in every circumstance everywhere. Some children of devout worshippers become atheists, some people raised as capitalists become communists, and some of the children of political, social, and cultural liberals become ardent conservatives. When making these generalizations, this chapter uses words like generally or tend to suggest that the statements are accurate for the bulk of the group or characteristic being discussed. For example, in the United States, about 7 out of 10 teenagers have political ideologies and partisan affiliations similar to their parents. Liberal teens tend to have liberal parents, and conservative youth generally have conservative parents. Still, about 1/3 of U.S. teenagers adopt different political ideologies from those they were raised with. 22. Video. Bernie Sanders says his childhood shaped his political views. In a 60 Minutes interview, Senator Bernie Sanders describes how his childhood experiences helped shape his political views. The identities of a young person's parent, affect that person's political socialization, if parental engagement in politics is high and party identification is strong. Children are more likely to adopt those attitudes and behaviors than if parental political engagement is low and their partisanship indifferent. 23 Family structure. Whether a child is living with two parents or a single parent, and whether parents are married, divorced, or cohabitating, for example, raises complex issues for political socialization that are not well understood. 24 Moreover, the impact of the family on socialization is not limited to children. Family dynamics also impact the political socialization of adults. 25. Peers. Your living situation growing up largely determines what influences you will encounter as you mature. Your school can influence your political socialization, as different schools have differing teaching philosophies, student bodies, and political activities. Likewise, your place of worship may have a profound influence on who you become. When you are young, your parents or guardians probably choose your school and religion. However, as people grow older, many of them spend less time with their parents or guardians and more time with their peers, including friends at school, work, community, and play. You may change your language, clothing, and interests to fit in with those in your group. And as you grow older, you are increasingly able to make your own decisions. A group of about 25 young adults pose, some sitting or standing on a railing and some in front of it, on a sidewalk near a paved road. Figure 6.4 Social peer groups can influence how individuals talk, how they communicate using physical gestures, and how they dress, and they can play a significant role in shaping individuals' views on politics. Credit. Globetown Massive, a Bangladeshi youth gang in Bethnal Green, Tower Hamlets, London, England by Bengali 71/Wikimedia Commons, CC by 3. It is less clear whether your peers will have a lasting impact on your political socialization. Like many things when you are growing up, your choice of peers is not entirely in your control. Most children don't pick where they live and where they attend primary school, and those two factors play a big part in determining the pool of people from which individuals can choose friends. In short, your parents, life circumstances, and choices shape who your peers are likely to be. Still, context is important. Before the advent of social media, parental decisions would almost entirely determine your pool of peers. Now, given internet access, young people can find their peer groups virtually anywhere. Increasingly, young people rely on social media to learn about the world and connect with others. Political scientists are still trying to decipher what this means for political socialization. In the past, a young person's peers tended to be local, other members of the clan, the village, or the church. Today, a young person's peers can be almost anywhere in the world, assuming they understand the same language, and thus young people and adults can more easily choose their peers based on common interests and beliefs than they could in the past. To the extent that young people, and indeed all individuals, can choose their social networks rather than being placed in them by virtue of their location, it is more likely that peer networks will reinforce existing beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors rather than change them. The ability of individuals to choose their social networks leads to echo chambers, which Chapter 12, the media will examine further. Other affiliations. Your family and peers greatly influence your political opinions, attitudes, values, and behaviors, but there are other important influences. How much these other influences affect a person's political socialization depends, in part, on how important they are to the person's identity and daily life. Video. What does being Indigenous mean? In this clip, Indigenous people in Canada explain what it means to them to be Indigenous. Consider ethnicity. The dominant ethnic group within a country, the white British within the United Kingdom, for example, may not perceive their ethnicity as having much of an influence on their political socialization, but its impact is likely to be profound. Members of ethnic majorities may be more likely to assume that politics and government should favor their interests as a matter of course because they may, naively, believe that what is good for them is good for everyone. Ethnic minorities, in contrast, may be socialized to feel the sting of discrimination and to view the government as no friend. One's ethnic identity is likely to be more salient if that identity signifies one as an outsider. 26. If you were raised in a devout family, that family's religion may have an important influence on your political socialization. 27 in the United States. For example, those individuals identifying as evangelicals are much more likely than the rest of the population to favor socially conservative public policies such as prohibiting same-sex marriage or curtailing abortion rights, and they are much more likely to support the Republican Party. At the opposite end of the spectrum, those raised as atheists are more likely to believe that governmental policy should not be based on religious principles. 28. Gender roles and gender identification can influence an individual's political socialization. Socialization into traditional gender roles may discourage women from developing interest or participating in politics. While in countries with women in leadership positions, young women may be socialized to become more politically aware and active. 29. The impact of gender identification and sexual orientation on political socialization is not well understood. But it seems likely that the greater the importance a person places on these attributes, and the more intense the formative experiences they have regarding these attributes, the greater the influence these attributes will have on that person's political socialization. 30. Teens dressed in formal clothing stand together for a group picture. The young women wear dresses and stand in a line in front of the young men, who wear suits. Figure 6.5 Socialization into gender roles, whether they be the traditional gender roles suggested by this photo or less traditional roles, may impact your political personality. Credit: Group shot by Oakley Originals / Flickr, CC by 2. Even though young people spend a lot of time in school, the impact of schooling on political socialization appears to be modest. Why? The schools children attend often reflect the choices and environment of their parents, so they have little independent influence on socialization. For example, if you come from a religious home and your family has the means to do so, your parents might choose to send you to religious school. This reinforces the influence of the family's religion on socialization. More broadly, the schools young people attend are likely to reflect the conditions and values that already exist in their environment. People are socialized as individuals, and they are socialized in groups, including their family, peers, and others in their social environments. As people are socialized, they become part of larger groupings of individuals with common characteristics. The next sections discuss these larger groupings. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to define political culture, mass culture, elite culture, and minority culture. Describe the effects of the weakening of mass cultures. Explain how political cultures form. If you have ever had the chance to travel to another country, you might have observed the behaviors, habits, values, and beliefs that distinguish that country from your own. Those distinguishing factors are in part a result of the way individuals in different countries are socialized. In Argentina, dinner doesn't typically start until around 10 p.m. In Norway, 5 o'clock is more common. The Japanese often have green tea and rice for breakfast. In Denmark, breakfast is more likely to be smoked eel and scrambled eggs. Each country has a different personality or culture. While Argentines, Norwegians, Japanese, and the Danes have national cultures that distinguish them from each other, cultures are not uniform within these or any other countries. Every country has various cultures within it, including a mass culture, an elite culture, and diverse minority cultures. The details of these cultures vary from country to country, but some characteristics are typical of culture in all countries. Culture refers to the shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices common to members of a group. The shared political attitudes, values, goals, and practices common to members of a political group, such as a country, a party, or any other political organization or grouping, is the group's political culture. 31. A country's political culture frames how individuals in that society see their roles as citizens, including their relationship to other political actors and to the government. The United States tends to be highly individualistic, prioritizing personal freedom and individual responsibility over more community-centered values. This individualism can appear odd to the citizens of countries that put much higher importance on communal values. For example, researchers asked Americans and Europeans, "What's more important in our society? That everyone can be free to pursue their life's goals without interference from the state, or that the state plays an active role in society so as to guarantee that nobody is in need?" Almost 6 in 10 Americans surveyed responded that individual freedom was more important, while nearly 8 in 10 Lithuanians, whose country was a part of the collectivist Soviet Union for nearly 50 years, responded that the state's active role was more important. 32. As with any generalization, political culture is open to unfortunate stereotyping. Not all. Americans favor individual freedom over state intervention. Not all Lithuanians prefer that the government play an active role to protect individuals. Generalizations are helpful to describe patterns and tendencies, but they should never be automatically attributed to specific individuals. Where can I engage? Public meetings. 2 people wearing suits sit behind a dais and look at a document showing a map that another person hands to them from the other side of the dais. Other people stand around the room talking. Figure 6.6, at meetings like this hearing on the legislative redistricting plan in Annapolis, Maryland, in 2011, members of the public are invited to comment on issues. Credit: Public hearing on the legislative redistricting plan by Maryland Gov.Pics/Flickr, CC by 2. Local governmental meetings are excellent venues for observing group decision-making in action. Careful observation may also yield clues about political cultures, but if you attend these meetings, you need not be a passive observer. City council meetings, school board meetings, or other local meetings frequently offer opportunities for public comment. Because there are some 90,000 local governments in the United States, 33, it is not possible to point to a single source of information regarding where, when, and why local meetings will occur. A simple web search can help you locate a wide array of local government meetings in your area. For example, if you had been in Fayetteville, Arkansas on Monday, November 1, 2021, you could have attended a city council tour, a meeting of the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board, or a meeting of the Animal Services Advisory Board. Whatever meeting you choose to attend, you will have a chance to engage in local political action. Elite culture. The term elite can trigger mixed reactions. Some people might hear the term and think positively of elite athletes, elite dancers, or elite musicians, those who, by virtue of their abilities or accomplishments, stand out as extraordinary. In many countries today, however, the term elite is usually less complimentary. People may complain, "The elites control everything," or "The elites take advantage of the rest of us." Those within a society who, by virtue of their wealth, status, position, and power, have the greatest influence over the country's political agenda, its policy decisions, and its decision-making cadre are the society's political elite. 30 for their political culture is the country's elite. Political culture. The degree of influence and domination of elite culture varies from country to country. At the extreme in North Korea, the ruling class, led by Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un, controls every aspect of political life. Kim Jong-un's grandfather was the first Supreme Leader of North Korea, and his father was the second. North Korean elite culture is his culture, and he expects to be worshipped. At the other end of the spectrum is New Zealand, where Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, whose parents were middle class, her mother was a school catering assistant, and her father was a police officer, who attended a public school, and who became one of only 2 elected heads of state to give birth while in office, leads the closest thing New Zealand has to a ruling class. Even in relatively egalitarian New Zealand, however, those with money, status, and power tend to set the agenda, influence policy decisions, and dominate the decision-making process. In the United States, there are multiple elite cultures: cultural, financial, and political. Members of these elite groups tend to live in major metropolitan areas, such as New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington, San Francisco, Boston, and Houston, attend highly selective colleges and universities, and have high incomes. 35. However, despite their commonalities, their political values and attitudes may differ sharply. The ultra-wealthy may be devoted either to liberal or conservative causes. The 1%, those wealthier than 99% of the rest of the population, are divided almost equally in how much they give to Republican or Democratic candidates for political office. 36 billionaires may be either liberal or conservative. And while at one time, the social networks of those politicians at the most elite levels within their parties might have overlapped, they do not overlap much anymore. Still, political elites have disproportionate influence over American public policy, and it is reasonable to believe that this finding would hold for other countries as well. 37. Connecting courses. Cultural anthropology. Political scientists are interested in political culture, a subset of the attitudes, values, goals, and practices the members of a group share that define that group's culture. If you want to learn more about culture itself, you might explore a course in cultural anthropology. According to the National Park System's Cultural Anthropology program, cultural anthropologists specialize in the study of culture and people's beliefs, practices, and the cognitive and social organization of human groups. Cultural anthropologists study how people who share a common cultural system organize and shape the physical and social world around them, and are in turn shaped by those ideas, behaviors, and physical environments. 38. Although cultural anthropologists use both quantitative and qualitative research methods, a hallmark of cultural anthropology is participant observation, in which the researcher spends an extensive amount of time living with and observing a cultural community. In a cultural anthropology course, you will learn techniques to make systematic observations so that you are able to describe and explain a culture in ways that are accurate and appropriate. Through systematic observation, you can develop a deep understanding about the knowledge people use to live their lives and the way in which they do so. Mass culture. The broadest culture within a country is its mass culture. Where do you get your political information? What movies do you watch? What kinds of sporting events do you attend? And where do you buy your clothes? While it is possible to distinguish between elite and mass cultures, the lines between them are not always distinct. Still, without too much stereotyping, it is safe to say that many members of elite cultures would generally answer these questions differently than members of mass cultures would. Prior to the rise of newspapers, radio, and television, mass culture, including political culture, did not exist. All culture was local. Individuals were influenced most by those with whom they had direct personal contact. As increasingly larger proportions of the population had access to these media, culture became increasingly mass, increasingly shared. Those living in smaller towns came to have access to the same tastes, styles, and information as those in the larger cities. Mass culture was most visible when the media was limited to newspapers, radio, and television. When television options were limited, mass culture included the shows that everybody watched. The most watched TV shows in the world include the Olympic Games and the FIFA World Cup. In India, Bollywood films have dominated the media landscape, as telenovelas have in the Americas. Mass culture, including mass political culture, is weakening. About 60% of the adult population in America watched the presidential debates between Nixon and Kennedy in 1960. In 2020, even during a highly contentious presidential campaign between President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden, fewer than 30% of adults watched the debates. More on this in Chapter 12. The media. 40. This move away from mass-focused attention on the same political events through a few media outlets holds true in countries around the world. As media options proliferate, mass culture diminishes and minority cultures flourish. People no longer get their political information from the media that everyone watches. Instead, they are able to obtain and share political information with those in their own, sometimes very specific political cultures. Minority cultures. When the political culture of the United States is described as prioritizing individual liberty and personal responsibility, that hardly describes how everyone in the United States thinks. Any statements about a national political culture will be far too broad to speak for the members of all the various communities within a country. This is especially true now that mass cultures are breaking down, with the rise of social media especially enabling minority cultures to flourish. A group of 3 Japanese young people wear dark tailored or corseted clothes in shades of black, blue, red, and purple. They wear floral accents in their hair, which is teased out and dyed or streaked with colors that coordinate with their clothes. They also wear dark, dramatic eye and lip makeup. Figure 6.7, the Japanese visual kei culture involves a blend of music and style. Credit: Harajuku Denizens 3 by Jacob Einmark/Flickr, CC BY 2. Minority cultures have their own consistency of beliefs and behaviors, of ideas and actions that bind them together. Minority cultures can be quite specific. For example, there are the Doomsday Preppers in the United States, Gopniks in Russia, 41 Cholos in Mexico, 42, and thousands of others. Subcultures can be all-consuming, as with a cult that dominates every aspect of cult members' lives, but an individual need not be connected to only one culture. Professional wrestling has its own culture, as does anime. Xavier Woods, you may never have heard of him, but many prominent figures in various cultures are unknown to the broader public, identifies with both 43. Video. Anime Lightning Round with WWE's Xavier Woods. In this clip, professional wrestler Xavier Woods describes anime and talks about some of his favorite anime shows and characters. Political cultures emerge organically in that they are not necessarily created with the intention of building political organizations. Instead, individuals with particular interests and lifestyles, environmentalism, queer identities, or gun ownership, among many other potential affiliations, find similar individuals and a community of interest forms. These communities of interest may grow into social movements or establish formal interest groups. Prior to the 1970s in the United States, the gay community culture was largely apolitical. 44 state-sanctioned violence against gays, and later, the AIDS epidemic, politicized the gay community and mobilized members of the community to organize interest groups and participate in a broader social movement. Video. What you need to know about the gay rights movement. After the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that affirmed the right of same-sex couples to marry, CNN aired this report on the history of the gay rights movement. Elements of Black American cultures provided a foundation for the civil rights movement in a continuous link from the 1960s to the Black Lives Matter movement. And the formal BLM organization of today 45 hip-hop is also a distinct political culture, 46 in some cases. Cultural activity has led to the formation of political parties, such as the Green parties that have spread to some 80 countries around the world. Neither a person's political socialization nor their cultural identity dictates precisely how they will behave in group settings or what the outcomes of the group interactions will be. An individual might identify as an ardent environmentalist, but nonetheless engage in polluting activities like using disposable diapers or routinely traveling by aircraft. One might ask, why does an environmentalist engage in polluting activities? Millions, virtually or physically, marched along with Thunberg to protest climate change and the public policies that allowed, or even spurred it to happen. Why didn't these millions of protesters have more success obtaining the policy changes they sought? To learn more about how individuals behave as part of a group or in group settings, and why policy change is often so hard to obtain, it's necessary to study some essential elements of group decision-making. This study will pay close attention to strategic behavior that sometimes leads to unfortunate consequences. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to discuss the major causes of collective dilemmas, describe the major types of collective dilemmas, explain ways to overcome collective dilemmas. The American public is pretty disgusted with the United States Congress. Public opinion polls show that, as of July 2021, Congress had a 12% approval rating, lower than any other institution rated in the poll 40. 7. The widespread discontentment with Congress was due in part to the public's view that Congress gets little done, and that what it does poorly. Public disenchantment with governments is not limited to the United States. Majorities in Mexico, Spain, Greece, Brazil, and other countries believe their democracies are not working well. 48, wherever democratic legislatures exist. In recent years, they have struggled to impress the people who elect them. There are lots of specific reasons for public disdain of legislative bodies, but one broad reason encapsulates them. Legislatures find it difficult to solve their collective problems. For 18 days in 2013 and then again for 35 days in 2018-2019, the U.S. government shut down because Congress and the president could not agree on ways to fund federal operations. The public was not amused by this deadlock. In a 2019 survey, 80% of the public believed that the shutdown was a very, or somewhat, serious problem for the country. 49. A group of people gather outside holding signs. One sign says, "Congress, do your job so I can do mine." Another sign says, "NTEU, the National Treasury Employees Union, www.ntu.org." Figure 6.8 Federal employees attend a rally seeking to end the government shutdown in 2013. Credit 10/4/13 CPC End Government Shutdown Rally by Keith Ellison/Flickr, CC by 2. If all people agreed on everything, there would be no collective dilemmas. But because individuals do have differing needs, preferences, and goals, they have to overcome challenges to make a decision. Whenever two or more individuals need to make a plan or resolve a conflict, and those involved do not agree on the solution, there is a collective dilemma. This is as true for two individuals deciding where to go to eat as it is for a national Congress trying to set policies for immigration, climate change, a pandemic, or the myriad other policy choices the legislature faces. Causes of collective dilemmas. Collective dilemmas exist when members of a group try to make decisions that all must agree to or comply with. If you are trying to decide where to go to dinner by yourself, there is no collective dilemma, but if you and a friend are deciding whether to go to dinner and where, there is at least the potential for a collective problem. Maybe you want to go out and your friend simply does not. One of you will be disappointed by whatever decision you make, or maybe you want to go one place and they want to go a different place. They want to go now and you want to go later. They have more money than you do, but you have more time. Have you had the experience of eating out with friends, and after the bill arrives and you all pitch in your fair share, you discover that there is not enough money to pay the bill? There are three main causes of collective dilemmas. The first is when the participants disagree because they have opposing preferences. Think of two political parties making a decision, divided into two sides with irreconcilable differences, for example, with one party favoring the death penalty and the other opposing it. There is no compromise that will satisfy both parties. The death penalty will either be allowed or be banned. The second cause is when participants generally agree on what they want to do but disagree over the details. General agreement does not mean specific agreement. Consider climate change policy. Should internal combustion, gas-powered, cars be banned, or should there just be incentives to buy electric cars? Should new houses be required to have solar panels, or should the government offer perks to encourage builders and homeowners to have them installed? In legislatures or courts, in interest groups or within bureaucracies, resolving the details of collective decisions creates numerous challenges involving coordination, transaction costs, and conformity costs. The third cause, when individual motivations are contrary to the group's mutual interests, is especially troubling. In this case, group members have a common interest or goal, but members of the group have incentives to make decisions that are actually harmful to the group and, ultimately, to themselves. Collective dilemmas of this sort are commonly called collective action problems. 50. Solutions to collective dilemmas when participants disagree. When a collective dilemma involves participants simply disagreeing on an appropriate course of action, e.g., whether to allow or ban capital punishment, The rules for making a decision can have an important influence on which side will prevail. As Chapter 2, Political Behavior is Human Behavior discussed, the rules by which decisions are made affect the ease with which agreements are reached. As a result, whether the death penalty will be legal depends on the decision-making rules and on the existing situation, that is, the status quo. If the rule is that a decision will be made by majority vote, the preferences of whichever voting group has the most members will become policy. If more people oppose capital punishment than support it, then capital punishment will be banned, and vice versa. Many types of voting rules exist. Voting rules are discussed further in Chapter 8. Interest groups, political parties and elections, and Chapter 9. Legislatures. Perhaps the most common is majority or plurality voting. Under majority rule, for a proposal or candidate to win, that option must receive more than 50% of the votes cast, usually defined as 50% plus 1. 51 in plurality voting, the proposal or candidate with the most votes wins, whether or not that person receives a majority of the votes. Supermajority rules typically require that the measure being voted upon receive 60%, 2/3, 67%, or even 3/4, 75% of votes. Whenever a supermajority rule exists, the status quo is more difficult to change. A jury box has 12 chairs for jurors to sit in, 7 in the back row and 5 in the front. An American flag stands in the corner. Figure 6.9 trials in the United States generally require the 12 jurors, who sit in a jury box like this one, to unanimously agree in order for a defendant to be convicted. Credit: Calhoun County Courthouse, Port Lavaca, Texas 1,805,151,209, by Patrick Feller/Flicker, CC by 2. The most extreme form of supermajority is found in most U.S. courtrooms, as well as in the courts of Australia and Ireland. For a defendant to be found guilty in a jury trial, the jury must unanimously agree. Otherwise, the defendant will either be released or face another trial. This is called a unanimity rule. How might these differing voting rules be explained? One sensible rationale is that the greater the consequences of making an incorrect decision, or the longer those consequences will last, the greater the need for a supermajority to guard against making rash or incorrect decisions. One of the most coercive things a state can do is to deprive a citizen of their liberty by imprisoning them, and one of the worst mistakes is to imprison an innocent person. So most democracies make it relatively difficult to convict suspected criminals. 52A. Unanimity rule helps guard against wrongful convictions, although it does not entirely prevent them. 53. Constitutions are the core document establishing the basic structure of the state, and laws are meant to address current problems. A constitution typically outlines the government's general powers and duties, while laws fill in the specifics regarding these matters. For more on constitutions, see Chapter 1, What is Politics and What is Political Science? To change a constitution generally requires a supermajority, while changing laws requires only a simple majority. Think of it this way: constitutions are the foundations of the house, while laws are the paint in the rooms. It is hard to change the foundation because it is meant to be durable, but it is easier to repaint the bedroom because people's taste in colors can change over the seasons. That is why voting rules typically make constitutional changes subject to supermajority votes and laws changeable by a simple majority. This is not true in every country, however. In an effort to ensure that legislation has support from minority parties, in South Korea, a 60% supermajority is required in the National Assembly to bring any measure up for a vote 54. Voting rules have another, more self-interested, political rationale. Those setting the rules have incentives to establish the kind of rules that will benefit their interests now and in the future. Those writing a constitution want it to be durable because the constitution represents how they believe their country should be ordered for generations to come. Therefore, they make the constitution difficult to change. There is also a self-interested reason for making constitutions difficult to change. Those writing them may be currently in power, but they can imagine a time when they may be in the minority. Constitutional authors thus try to lock in their preferences in ways that will make it difficult for those with other preferences to change the document. This does not mean that it is easy to come to an agreement about how to write the Constitution or other rules in the first place. What happens when those trying to make a collective decision are simply not able to make one, such as when a vote is split 50-50 or when there are not enough votes to make the required supermajority? In those cases, the status quo prevails. Rules shape but do not determine outcomes. When political actors disagree, it is always possible that one side will prevail, because it is able to persuade its opponents. In the United States, there has been substantial conflict over whether same-sex marriages should be legal. As recently as 2004, the American public opposed same-sex marriage by a 2-to-1 margin. By 2019, those numbers had reversed, with public opinion polls showing that 61% favored legalization, while only 31% opposed it. 55 decisions regarding same-sex marriage followed public opinion, and changing minds changed policy 56. If one or both sides decide not to play by the rules, but instead to use violence to accomplish their goals, then force, and not votes, may determine which side prevails. One of the reasons Greta Thunberg's calls for climate action have not been adequately answered is that there remains substantial opposition to the kinds of policies that would be necessary to limit climate change. But what happens when those making decisions basically agree about what should be done? These cases may still present other difficulties, which the following sections will examine. Solutions to collective dilemmas when there is general agreement. If you have tried to coordinate the actions of a group, family, school, church, community, or any other gathering, then you have directly experienced coordination problems. Coordination problems occur whenever a group seeks to make a decision on a common course of action. The group members generally agree on what they are seeking, and everyone in the group will need to live with the results, but it's not possible to give every group member exactly what they want. Coordination problems become more complex the greater the size of the group. Deciding what movie to watch in a group of two. Depending on the personalities of the two, this may be a pretty easy coordination problem. If the group has 20 or 20,000 or 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000 members, the coordination challenges become increasingly complex. There are various ways to solve coordination problems, but they boil down to two main possibilities. One way is to delegate decision-making power to a single person or a small set of people who will act on behalf of all. Another way is to have everyone participate in making decisions, for example, through voting or some other deliberative methods. Each solution has its own advantages and disadvantages. Delegating power to a single person reduces transaction costs but increases conformity costs. Group decision-making is likely to reduce conformity costs but to increase transaction costs. The following sections discuss those concepts. Transaction costs. When political scientists speak of costs, they do not mean just monetary costs. They mean the use of resources to obtain some benefit. The cost, use of resources of making a decision, the benefit, can include monetary costs, such as the expense of printing ballots, but perhaps more importantly, it can also involve time and effort. The money, time, and effort necessary to make group decisions are called transaction costs 57. The more people involved in the decision-making process and the more complicated the decision, the higher the transaction costs. The higher the transaction costs, the more difficult it is to make a decision. Think back to the "where do we go for dinner?" question. With 3 people, the transaction costs will be modest, and you'll probably be able to arrive at a decision. As the number of individuals in the group increases, the transaction costs, the costs of making the decision, are also likely to increase. If the costs become too high, imagine how much time and effort it would take for 300 people to agree on where to eat and to find a restaurant that can host them. Then the decision-making process can break down. What happens then? The status quo prevails, which, in this example, means that nobody is going to a restaurant. What if you are deeply committed to maintaining the status quo? You can deliberately raise transaction costs to the point that no changes to the status quo can be made. Defenders of the status quo do not necessarily need to defend it. They just need to raise the transaction costs high enough so that no changes can be enacted. In recent years, there have been major political battles over voting rights. As of July 2021, efforts to impose new voting restrictions in the state of Texas had been thwarted by virtue of a dedicated Democratic minority's efforts to increase the costs of passing legislation. The minority's strategy: flee the state capitol, depriving the majority of the quorum, the minimum number of the group that must be present for a vote to be held. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Republicans were in the minority and did their best to stall measures to expand voting rights, also by throwing up procedural roadblocks to the legislation. In each case, the minority party Democrats in Texas, Republicans in Washington, chose to raise transaction costs in order to prevent a change from being made. Texas ultimately approved the restrictions on voting rights after the Democratic minority gave in and returned to the state capitol to vote, thus lowering the transaction costs. What can I do? Collective action and critical thinking. 3 people, 2 seated and 1 standing, look at an open laptop. Figure 6.1, the EU-funded Biodiversity Information for Development Program, BID, runs workshops to help participants learn to use data to come to collaborative decisions that direct public policy. Credit: BID Workshop, Data Use for Decision-Making by GBIF, photo by Maliani Raymond/Flickr, CC by 2. One of the biggest challenges that individuals, groups, and governments face is trying to figure out how to allocate limited resources, which may be intangible things like time and effort. As discussed in this chapter, people are often asked to make difficult decisions with seemingly no correct or good answer. This is especially true when the problem that needs to be solved impacts a community, be it a country, a city, or even a neighborhood. As you go through the process of trying to decide which option to choose in order to solve issues related to things like resource depletion, pollution, or reducing transaction costs, what you are really doing is engaging in critical thinking. At its core, being able to think critically involves not only being able to describe the issue at hand, but also taking relevant ideas, perspectives, and data about a particular problem or issue, and using that information to assist in analyzing different perspectives and arguments to reach an informed conclusion about the issue. Critical thinking is hard work. It requires a lot of information and a lot of time, but it gets easier with practice, and it leads to better outcomes. Conformity costs. Transaction costs are the price of making a decision, and conformity costs are the price those who do not get what they want must pay to arrive at a decision. For each person affected by the collective decision, the conformity cost is the difference between what the person wanted from the decision and what they actually got out of it. When you were making the collective decision about where to go for dinner, you might have argued for sushi. If the final decision was for tacos, your conformity cost would be the difference between the smaller amount of satisfaction you will get from having tacos and the greater happiness you would have gotten from having sushi. School provides another example. Your classes always meet at the same time. Most likely everyone in a class has the same assignments and takes the same tests at the same time, and so forth. These are all factors that impose conformity costs. If every student's education was personalized to meet their own preferences and goals, with schedules, assignments, and exams all designed for that purpose, that would be an educational system with extremely low conformity costs. But the establishment and monitoring of such a system would create enormous transaction costs. How would classrooms be assigned, for example? To the extent that education is personalized, college students can choose their own majors and select electives, for example. The transaction costs are higher because this requires more complicated administration, e.g., some official has to track your schedule to make sure that you are completing all the requirements. Consider driving laws. When the government imposes speed limits on the driving public, the conformity cost is the difference between how fast drivers want to drive and how fast they are allowed to drive. Speed limits apply to everyone. They are not variable based on the skills or preferences of the driver. No one under the legal age can obtain a driver's license, but almost anyone over the legal age can. These are just a few examples of government policies that limit transaction costs but increase conformity costs. Transaction costs and conformity costs often move in different directions. When transaction costs are low, conformity costs are often high, and vice versa. The lowest transaction cost occurs when a single decision maker can rule by decree. For example, we will watch this movie. In Brunei and in other countries ruled by absolute dictators, transaction costs are minimal. The Sultan speaks, and it is so. The lowest conformity costs exist when individuals can simply do whatever they want. Contrast the centralized power of Brunei with the city council meetings in Fayetteville, Arkansas. At those meetings, and in similar meetings around the United States, virtually any resident may voice their concerns on any issue before the council. Meetings do not end until everyone who wants to speak has been heard. A group of people, some wearing turbans, sit together talking in a room, some on the floor and some in chairs. Figure 6.11 Tribal leaders in Afghanistan meet to discuss options for diffusing local unrest. Credit 101,117 AW3011-6 by Resolute Support Media/Flickr, CC by 2. If you ever have the chance to attend a group meeting in which a large number of people attempt to decide what to do, whether that meeting involves tribal leaders in Afghanistan, party leaders in China, or an indigenous deliberative assembly in Bolivia, you will quickly learn that these meetings move slowly. Not every voice will ultimately influence policy. Those arguing to pass the bill and those arguing to kill the bill will not both be satisfied, even if they are both heard. But when multiple voices are heard, the chances that the final measure will be more closely tailored to the preferences of everyone in the group are higher than if those voices were not heard. Video. Ordinance would finally allow for public comment at Cleveland City Council meetings. This news clip from April 2021 reports on an ordinance that would allow public comment at Cleveland City Council meetings. The council approved new procedures for public comment in September 2021. Is it better to have lower transaction costs or lower conformity costs? It depends. When decisions must be made and made quickly, it is better to minimize transaction costs. If a country is under surprise attack, for example, that may not be the best time for long, deliberative conferences. In such a circumstance, the longer a country deliberates, the more it is likely to lose, so quick and decisive action, that is, decisions with low transaction costs, are essential. When a political party is deciding what its platform will be, on the other hand, it makes sense for the party to listen to multiple voices in order to attract multiple voters. Under those circumstances, expediency is less important than leading the various supporters of the party to believe that the party seeks the same things they seek. Discussions are lengthy precisely so that all the various interests can be heard. Solving coordination problems is no easy task, and finding solutions with acceptable amounts of transaction and conformity costs is often a challenge. As difficult as it can be, when people of good faith come together to confront these challenges, they can be successful. To avoid existential threats, they must find a way to coordinate 58. Resolving so-called prisoners' dilemmas, discussed in the next section, is a different matter because they contain features that make it difficult to arrive at decisions that benefit both the larger public and the individuals involved. The problem with prisoners' dilemmas is not coordination costs. The problem with prisoners' dilemmas is that individuals have strong incentives to do things that are not socially beneficial. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the roots of collective action problems, describe the causes of the tragedy of the commons, use political examples to explain the tragedy of the commons, describe the causes of the free rider problem, use political examples to explain the free rider problem, identify the logic underlying the prisoner's dilemma. Collective action problems exist when individuals, acting rationally in pursuit of their self-interest, have incentives to make decisions that are harmful to the interests of others as well as, ultimately, the individual themselves. Collective action problems are everywhere in politics. In classical economic theory, collective action problems are not seen as a natural condition. Classical economic theory holds that individuals will act to benefit themselves, and that in doing so they will also benefit others through the invisible hand. 59. Remember the log-rolling example in Chapter 2? Two individuals each have an apple and an orange. One individual really loves oranges, the other apples. They each have self-interested incentives to trade that which they care for less for that which they desire more. Voila! One person gives the other an apple, the other gives an orange, and they both are better off even though neither acted with the interest of the other person in mind. Collective action logic comes to the opposite conclusion, one in which individuals acting in their own self-interest can have incentives that lead them to act in ways that harm not only the broader public, but also themselves. Collective action problems fall into three main categories: the tragedy of the commons, free riding, and the prisoner's dilemma. The tragedy of the commons, which results in the depletion of a resource available to all, poses particular threats to global health and welfare. The problem of free riding, wherein individuals not participating in a group activity nonetheless benefit from the activity, makes it difficult to change the status quo. Finally, the prisoner's dilemma, a situation in which individuals act strategically in ways that ultimately harm themselves, demonstrates why it can be challenging to get allies to work together. The tragedy of the common 60. The world's resources are finite. In southern Africa in the 20th century, overhunting nearly led to the extinction of the black rhino. 61 many types of fish, including tuna, cod, and halibut, among others, are being pulled out of the ocean at commercially unsustainable levels. 62. The climate is changing because humans are in effect using up the atmosphere's capacity to absorb greenhouse gases. 63. Whenever there is a resource that anyone within a group can tap or exploit, that resource is a commons. Regarding fish and fishing, the oceans have been a commons. If anyone can withdraw water from a river, that river is a commons. Likewise, if anyone can emit air pollution, the atmosphere is a commons. A hand holds a tuna fish over a bin containing other fish. Figure 6.12, commercial fishing of tuna and other species can lead to a tragedy of the commons. Credit: Tuna Fish by Mottaz Altahir/Flickr, public domain. In each of these cases, the same principle dominates. If anyone has access to the commons, whether that resource is the rhino grazing in Africa, the tuna swimming in the northern Atlantic, or the atmosphere, and that resource is scarce, then every individual has an incentive not only to take what they need, but also to take as much as they want. Individuals have this incentive because they can sell this scarce resource, rhino horns, tuna fish, or because they benefit today without consideration of future consequences. If everyone took only what they needed, some renewable resources could become replenished. But if everyone has the incentive to take as much as they can, pretty soon those resources will be depleted. No one can access a resource that has been depleted. If everyone had shared, there may well have been enough to meet everyone's long-term needs. In the paradox of the tragedy of the commons, those who seek to hoard resources ultimately have less even for themselves. Bluefin tuna, highly valued for its use in sushi, carries a high price, and so commercial fisheries have strong incentives to catch as many of them as they can. Between the 1970s and the early 2000s, the Atlantic population of bluefins declined by an estimated 80% due to overfishing. And scientists warned that the species faced extinction unless the tragedy of the commons was averted. 64, though tuna became extinct in the Black Sea, primarily due to overfishing and other environmental pressures. Strictly enforced catch quotas helped avert the tragedy in the Atlantic. 65, sadly. There are numerous other examples, such as overfishing in places like China and Chile, the depletion of freshwater resources in places like Australia and Saudi Arabia, and worsening traffic congestion in places like Los Angeles and Cairo, as roads are a scarce resource that can be overconsumed. Video. What is the tragedy of the commons? This TED lesson uses a simple, step-by-step example to explain the tragedy of the commons. Global climate change is perhaps the most pressing example of the tragedy of the commons. 66 tragedies of the commons could be prevented if everyone, especially those who take the most, whether individuals or countries, took less, but no single person or country has the incentive to do so. The free rider problem. At some point, you have probably been asked to work on group assignments. You might have asked yourself how much effort you wanted to devote to this team activity. Whether you worked like crazy or did nothing at all, you would get the same grade as everyone else in the group. Though of course doing nothing would mean you'd have no control over what that grade might be. So what would you do? The selfish and strategic or lazy individual might well say, I'll do as little as possible. This behavior, accepting a benefit without contributing to its achievement, is an example of the free rider problem. If every member of the group thinks the same way, no work will get done, and your group will receive a well-earned failing grade. Paradoxically, the group as a whole has incentives to work together to obtain their goal, but the individual members of the group do not. In small groups, it is fairly easy to identify and control free riding through mutual peer pressure and the belief that failing to contribute might actually hurt the team's grade. But in the political world, most groups are much larger, and free riding is much more difficult to spot and manage. The logic of free riding creates enormous barriers to political change and complicates efforts to resolve policy problems. 67 Political change is difficult to achieve, given its tendency to favor the status quo. It requires the willingness of political actors like individuals, groups, and parties to devote the time, effort, and other resources sufficient to effect change. Again, climate change provides a useful example. It poses potentially existential threats to the global community. In the past few years, climate change has contributed to extraordinary bushfires in Australia, floods in Indonesia, India, and Europe, and heat waves in the Pacific Northwest and Siberia. These more. Frequent and intense droughts, storms, and heat waves, rising sea levels, and warming ocean temperatures are wreaking havoc on agriculture, public health, and social stability. Given these threats, it would seem that policymakers around the world would have sufficient incentive to work together to prevent worsening global climate change. Yet they have not, at least not in ways that have actually led countries to meet their climate change commitments. From the perspective of any individual country's leaders, climate change is occurring whether or not their country makes any changes or sacrifices. As responding effectively requires changing the status quo, each country's political leaders may decide to support change rhetorically, but not in practice. The Paris Climate Accord of 2015, the agreement of 197 countries to limit global warming, called for countries to take actions to limit average global temperatures to a rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius. 68. Unfortunately, only a few countries, including Morocco, the Gambia, and possibly India, have taken the steps necessary to do their part. The United States, Russia, and many other countries are barely trying. Facing an existential crisis, most countries have not stopped free riding. Still, there is reason for hope. Free riding can be limited. To suggest that climate change politics are only a matter of free riding would be an oversimplification. Each country has its own political dynamics, and its political leaders face internal pressures and international ambitions. Poorer countries have produced fewer greenhouse gases than richer countries. Economic development has been closely linked to the use of the fossil fuels 70, and so these countries argue that they have the right to continue the economic development linked to climate emissions. Richer countries pollute much more per person than poorer countries, and they often find it difficult to break a status quo that favors continued greenhouse gas emissions. True progress on combating climate change will continue to be challenging as long as each country has incentives to free ride on attempts to reduce global climate change. The prisoner's dilemma. Imagine this scenario. The police apprehend two individuals they suspect of committing an armed robbery. They have evidence that both suspects are guilty of carrying an unlawful weapon, and though they strongly suspect at least one of the two individuals has committed the more serious crime of armed robbery, they have no direct evidence to back up their suspicions. Video. The prisoner's dilemma. Simple scenarios help explain the idea of the prisoner's dilemma. The police separate the suspects so that they cannot communicate with each other, and then they tell each suspect, "We know that one of you is guilty of the robbery, but we don't know which one. We can prove you are guilty of the weapons charge, so if we can't find out who is guilty of the robbery, then both of you are going to prison for 1 year on the weapons charge." However, if you inform on your accomplice, political scientists call this defecting. If you do not give away your accomplice, you are said to be cooperating with your fellow suspect, not with the police. Will drop the weapons charge, you'll be released, and your guilty accomplice will serve an 8-year sentence. If you blame each other, we still won't know which of you actually committed the crime, so you both will be convicted of being an accessory to armed robbery, with a sentence of 5 years 71. Person A. Stay silent, cooperate, accuse defect. Person B. Stay silent, cooperate A. 1 year. B. 1 year A. 0 years. B. 8 years. Accuse defect A. 8 years. B. 0 years A. 5 years. B. 5 years. Table 6.1 Dilemma Schema. Based on this scenario, both suspects would be better off if they remained silent. They would each receive a relatively minimal 1-year sentence. You can see the other possible outcomes in Table 6.1. No matter what Person B thinks Person A will do, Person B is better off accusing them. And Person A has the same incentives. No matter what Person B does, Person A has good reasons to accuse Person B. If both people remain silent, they would serve a total of 2 years in prison. If one accuses the other and the other remains silent, the total prison time would be 8 years. If each accuses the other, they will spend a total of 10 years in prison. The socially best outcome, if that is defined as the outcome with the minimum total prison time, is for both of the accused to remain silent. However, as each individual has a strong incentive to claim the other is guilty, the predicted outcome is the worst outcome, with 10 total years of prison time. This is the prisoner's dilemma. Individuals, acting strategically in their own self-interest, have incentives that lead them to take actions that result in unnecessarily negative outcomes for both parties. Video. Golden Balls game show illustrates the prisoner's dilemma. This clip from the British game show Golden Balls perfectly illustrates the prisoner's dilemma. Even though both players would have benefited if they had cooperated, they chose not to cooperate and so hurt themselves. Video. Game show contestants overcome the prisoner's dilemma through strategic decision-making. In this second clip, the players show how a prisoner's dilemma can be overcome through strategic decision-making. But note that in this scenario, the players were allowed to talk with each other so that they could give signals about what their strategies were. There are many real-life examples of prisoners' dilemmas in politics. Two opposing political candidates may each prefer to run only positive campaign ads, but each fears the other will go negative to gain an advantage. Both candidates consequently run negative ads, which tarnish the reputations of each. When tensions rise between two countries over a border dispute, each country may feel pressure to strike first. The country that strikes first may gain an advantage over the country that does not. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain why collective action problems are less common and easier to resolve in small groups. Describe the 3 main ways to resolve the tragedy of the commons. Describe the reasons why each resolution to a collective action problem is imperfect. Describe the 3 main ways to address the free riding problem. Identify the principal solutions to the prisoner's dilemma. Collective action problems are pernicious. While they are difficult, but not impossible, to eradicate, failure to do so can lead to serious consequences to people's health and welfare. Each of the 3 main types of collective action problems is easier to solve, at least in principle, when the problems arise within small groups of people, such as families or tribal units, in which the members know each other well and have to live with each other over a long period of time. If you free ride by not pitching in to keep your living space clean, those living with you are going to notice and probably try to find ways to compel you to do your fair share. If you share a refrigerator with others, you will need to find a way, such as labeling whose food is whose, to prevent a tragedy of the commons in which food vanishes and is not replaced. Should a prisoner's dilemma scenario arise, the better the suspects know each other and the more they trust each other, the more likely it is that they will cooperate. For small groups, the strength of the personal relationships, the power to monitor for infractions, and the ability to provide suitable rewards and enforce appropriate punishments are the keys to avoiding or mitigating collective action problems. Formal mechanisms need not be established. You cannot know the resolution of collective action problems in advance. What happens depends on the decisions that those involved in the resolution make. Where can I engage? Testing solutions to collective action problems. The evolution of trust. A screenshot shows 2 stick figures on either side of a square, one wearing a red fez and one wearing a blue fez. A heading above the square reads, "The game of trust, you have one choice. In front of you is a machine, If you put a coin in the machine, the other player gets 3 coins, and vice versa. You both can choose to cooperate, put in a coin, or cheat, don't put in a coin. Words below the square read, let's say the other player cheats and doesn't put in a coin. What should you do? 2 cartoon buttons appear at the bottom of the image, one labeled cheat and the other labeled cooperate. Figure 6.13. This screenshot shows the first step in one of the simulations you can play at the Evolution of Trust. Credit: Screenshot of The Evolution of Trust by Nikki Case, CC01. 0. To see how different choices can influence the outcomes of collective action problems, you can experiment with various scenarios using Canadian game designer Nikki Case's free online game theory simulator, The Evolution of Trust. But what works for a small group is not sufficient for larger groups, and politics typically involves large groups. In large groups, most individuals will not necessarily trust or even know each other, except perhaps through their cultural identifications. If you try to free ride in a group of 4, the other group members will definitely notice. If you free ride in a group of 40 million, no one is likely to perceive your absence or lack of effort. Challenges in preventing tragedies of the commons or avoiding the worst outcomes of prisoners' dilemmas also grow with the numbers of individuals involved. 72. Collective action problems involving large numbers of people cannot rely on personal relationships. They require other mechanisms for monitoring and enforcement. Remedies for free riding, tragedies of the commons, and prisoners' dilemmas involving large groups differ, but all 3 types of problems require political solutions. Show me the data. Carbon dioxide, CO2, emissions are a key source of the greenhouse gases that are creating a warmer and more variable climate. This map shows per capita 73 CO2 emissions across countries. View interactive map at https or World in Data. org/grapher/co emissions per capita. Per capita emissions are calculated in order to make fairer apples-to-apples comparisons. That is, you can compare how much a typical person in each country pollutes to how much a typical person in every other country pollutes. A world map shows per capita CO2 emissions for each country. Countries in North America, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Australia have the highest carbon dioxide emissions, while countries in Central Africa have the lowest emissions. Figure 6.14. More industrialized, wealthier countries tend to emit higher levels of CO2 than other countries. Credit: Per capita CO2 emissions by Our World in Data, CC by 4. 0. The biggest per capita polluters are smaller, oil-producing countries such as Qatar, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. Other heavily populated, affluent countries that are high emitters include the United States, Canada, and Australia, among others. Residents of these countries emit more than 150 times as much CO2 as do those living in the poorest countries, such as the Central African Republic, Chad, and Niger. The 4 largest political regions based on population, China, the United States, the European Union, and India, contribute more than half of all CO2 emissions. Each would need to reduce their overall emissions to forestall further climate change. 74. If a climate tragedy of the commons is to be averted, each country must bear its fair share of the burden. Resolving tragedies of the commons. 2 remedies for the tragedies of the commons require governmental power. 1 remedy gives a central institution, the government, the authority to protect the commons through force. If the government has a long-term interest in maintaining the commons and the de facto power to do so, it can prevent individuals from depleting the resource. Alternatively, the government can put a price on privatize the resource so that anyone who wants to use the resource must pay for it. In this case, the resource is no longer a commons open to all. Think back to the bluefin tuna example. To help prevent their extinction in the Atlantic, the U.S. government instituted a number of requirements for commercial fisheries, including that they purchase one of a limited number of permits, abide by catch limits, and report how many tuna they caught. 75. In an ideal world, the United States would offer just enough permits, with the right catch limits, at the right price, so that as many tuna as possible would be caught without depleting the tuna population, and the permits would be bought by those who value them most. In the ideal world, fisheries would abide by established limits, and their reports would confirm that they had done so. If a commons existed completely within the border of a single country, that country could potentially solve the tragedy on its own. Tuna, however, are highly migratory, and fisheries from many countries seek them. They are part of an international commons. The International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas, ICCAT, is an intergovernmental organization established in 1966 to address this international problem. ICCAT had the same basic goals and tools as the United States, but regrettably, the organization had no powers to enforce, no sanctions with which to punish. And so, it was ineffective in protecting the commons, at least in its early years. 76. The solutions of governmental control or privatization each have their own problems. The government may protect the commons by taking control of it, but the government might use the resources to benefit political elites rather than for the benefit of the community as a whole. And while emperors have reason to preserve the resource, believing their family will rule indefinitely, elected politicians are focused squarely on the short term, the next election, rather than on preserving the resource for their grandchildren's generation. When the government takes control of the commons, it does not necessarily use the commons wisely. Privatizing a resource has its own pitfalls. Those who are used to exploiting the commons without paying for it, in the example above, the fisheries, will object to making costly what was once free. The more politically powerful the group, the more difficult it is for elected officials to protect the resource through privatization. Elected officials face pressure to offer more permits for greater exploitation at lower prices. As a result, the prices the government sets for the resource are usually too low, and the resource is allowed to be depleted faster than it can be sustained. Even if governmental officials did not face public opposition, privatizing the resource is challenging. If the government sets the prices too low, the resource will be depleted, and if it sets the prices too high, the community will be deprived of a valuable resource. Moreover, the more valuable the resource, the more likely it is that individuals will attempt to exploit it. In that case, preventing exploitation may require heavy policing and harsh punishments. The giant moa, a bird weighing as much as 500 pounds and standing 12 feet tall, was hunted to extinction by the Maori in New Zealand in the 15th century. A true tragedy of the commons. 77. Fortunately, the Maori were able to turn to other sources of food. Today's tragedy of the commons challenges, like global climate change, are much greater than a single bird for a single group. A person hides behind a tree, aiming a long spear at a large bird standing in front of the tree. Figure 6.15, the moa was hunted to extinction in a tragedy of the commons. Credit: Hunting Moa by Joseph Smith, Extinct Monsters by Rev H. and Hutchinson / Wikimedia Commons. Public domain. Historically, businesses that emitted CO2 polluted for free. To reduce pollution, governments can put a price on it. Every unit of pollution you emit will cost you this much. This price is typically referred to as a carbon tax. 78. The idea is that if you make it costly to pollute, people will pollute less. But this will be true only if the tax is high enough to coerce polluters to substantially reduce their emissions. Governments find it hard to impose these taxes because those being taxed resist. Because so many human activities create a carbon footprint. Virtually, everyone would see higher prices on their electric or gas bills, as well as at the grocery store and all the other places they shop. High carbon taxes are almost certain to produce beneficial long-term consequences for human health and welfare, and the short-term costs to individuals and businesses can be mitigated. 79. Still, those costs are immediate, and the benefits are in the future. As a result, countries have had enormous difficulty in setting carbon taxes high enough to prevent additional global warming. 80. Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom proposed a relatively effective solution to the tragedy of the commons that relies neither on a sovereign nor on prices. 81. Ostrom suggested that effective solutions can arise from the communities that use a resource once they recognize the commons problem and their mutual interest in resolving it. Community members are more likely than distant governments to understand the problem and to have a stake in remedying it. When Ostrom identified communities around the world that have come together to solve such problems, she observed two necessary details that allow these community solutions to work. First, the community must engage in collective decision-making so that all relevant interests can participate. Second, the rules the community makes must be clear so that members know what is allowed and what is not. If these conditions are in place, the decisions the community makes are likely to be wise and enforceable, as community members can monitor each other to prevent cheating. Ostrom found evidence supporting these principles in places ranging from the Japanese villages of Hirano and Nagik, the Huerta irrigation mechanism between Valencia, Murcia, and Alicante in Spain, and the Zandera irrigation community in the Philippines. 82. Since Ostrom's examples all involve small communities in which members know each other and have roughly equal power, it's unclear whether her findings point the way to a solution that can be implemented at the global level. In the absence of a solution like the one Ostrom proposes, communities tend to turn to a sovereign to impose restrictions or set prices. Since there is no global sovereign, the climate change crisis remains an especially challenging collective action problem. Resolving free riding problems. The best way to resolve the free rider problem is to disincentivize free riders. One powerful tool to discourage free riding is to keep groups small. Because in politics groups are usually large, they must develop other mechanisms to identify free riders and to deter their behavior. These mechanisms come with a cost. The group must devote resources to monitoring and punishing unwanted behavior, and group members need to subject themselves to some form of surveillance. Every country needs to collect taxes to fund government programs. If no one paid taxes, roads would never be repaved, safety regulations could not be enforced, the military would be unfunded, and the government could not provide disaster relief, just to name a handful of the many services that taxes allow the government to deliver. Still, few citizens would voluntarily send a check to pay their fair share of taxes unless they had strong incentives to do so. The most basic incentive, failure to pay taxes, is a crime, punishable by fines and imprisonment. If you know there is some chance you will be caught and violators are punished, this may provide sufficient incentive not to free ride. In addition to monitoring and fines, to prevent individuals or corporations from evading their obligations by moving their money into other jurisdictions, countries try to coordinate their tax policies. In 2021, the G7 nations, a group of the world's largest economies that includes Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the United States, did just that, agreeing to a coordinated global minimum corporate tax of no less than 15%. 83. In the United States, the likelihood that a citizen's taxes will be audited has dropped substantially in recent decades, especially among high-income individuals, as the federal government has devoted fewer resources to the Internal Revenue Service, the agency responsible for collecting taxes. 84. While most citizens pay the taxes they owe, free riding deprives the U.S. Treasury of some $400 billion, about 15% of all taxes owed, each year. 85. To reduce the amount of free riding, the U.S. government would need to devote additional resources to monitoring and enforcement. Monitoring and penalties are not the only way to prevent free riding. Another approach is to create strong social solidarity. Political organizations and governments seek to create these bonds of common connection. Through civic education and social signaling, they send the message that citizens should pay their taxes not just because they will be punished if they don't. They should pay them because that is what good, patriotic citizens do. In the countries with the highest tax compliance, that is, with the lowest rates of free riding, citizens generally pay their taxes because they believe the tax system is fair and that it is a civic duty to pay your taxes, and because there is widespread faith that other citizens are also paying their fair share. 86. It also helps if the government is competent so that citizens can see that their taxes are being used responsibly. The tragedy of the commons and the prospect of free riding are especially relevant for slow-growing crises like climate change. It is unlikely that the Maori knew that they were literally hunting the moa to extinction, gradually eliminating a valuable source of food. Each year, there were fewer birds to hunt, but maybe imperceptibly so, until the moa vanished. Like the Maori, many countries are slow to address the problem of climate change. even though the changes appear to be accelerating and creating irreversible damage. 87. Resolving prisoners' dilemmas. Prisoners' dilemmas create risks that can lead to more immediate but no less catastrophic outcomes. When two countries are at the brink of war, each might believe that it is more beneficial to attack than to wait, that is, to defect rather than to cooperate. The simplest solution to the prisoner's dilemma is for both participants to cooperate rather than to defect. However, they are likely to do so only under certain conditions. A participant is least likely to defect when they know that the other participant will punish them if they do. If they each know they will be punished if they defect, then they are more likely to remain silent. Preventing or ending prisoners' dilemmas requires that the participants know they will be punished if they defect, that a third party will enforce cooperation, or that the participants have mutual trust. Once one of the parties defects in a prisoner's dilemma setting, it is not easy to get the participants to cooperate later. As in the persistent conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, cases where any two groups are locked in intractable disagreements exemplify how tit-for-tat retaliation dominates any possibility of mutual agreement. The two parties have learned not to trust each other. Once that happens, rebuilding trust is difficult. It is easier to lose trust than to gain it. In a prisoner's dilemma, once a party has defected, the other party might well assume that the party that defected can never be trusted. Avoiding this outcome requires a third party that can enforce cooperation or punish those who defect to induce future cooperation.